Hey, Cypher here with another Historians Who Changed History. I haven't done one of these in a while, and this one's going to be kind of interesting because we're going to be looking at what some might consider the beginning of the Cold War. Now this time, it's going to be a little different from any of the other ones that I've done previously, because I want to talk about George F. Kennan, a historian who made his mark outside of the history profession and became a historian kind of in spite of what had been happening outside of the history profession that made him famous in the first place. Seriously, this guy never really intended to become a historian. He just did some research on the side. But because of him becoming a historian after his political career, one could consider him the foremost expert on the American Small War that I've studied the most, the Russian intervention. So he changed history in a very different way from how most historians do, because what I've previously talked about is people who changed the history profession from within the profession, as in theoretical changes or founding the profession itself. But George F. Kennan was the architect of the Policy of Containment, what some might consider the beginning of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So, in a sense, you could say that a historian started the Cold War, although that would be quite an overstatement. Of course, Kennan's role in all of this is mostly misunderstood by the public, and normally really understood by the people who have had to deal with his historical writings. So even historians of the Cold War often kind of don't understand his role in things. And the reason why is that he was basically ousted from politics by those in power, and became a historian as a result. It's kind of a fascinating story. Kennan began his career in 1925 when he began the newly created U.S. Foreign Service, which provides personnel for diplomats and whatnot. He was sent to learn the Russian language from the University of Berlin, and he was stationed accordingly. After the U.S. finally recognized the USSR in 1933, he was sent as part of the embassy that was established in Moscow. He was able to study the communist government during the era of Stalin's Great Purges, and of course, as a result, he grew to despise them. Much like another famous George Kennan, which George F. Kennan is actually related to, he became a scholarly source with strong opinions on Russian affairs. Those opinions made him not really get along with the second ambassador to the USSR, so he was sent to another post in 1938. Since he was assigned to Berlin in World War II, he was actually sent to a concentration camp for a couple of months before being allowed to leave. Eventually, he made it back to Moscow, where he stayed until a year after the war ended. The reason why he went back to the US in 1946 is what made his career. He sent an extremely long telegram from the Soviet Union to the US, arguing what the US should do to confront the Soviet Union through policy. He was brought back from the Soviet Union because of this long telegram to become part of the growing group of experts in the Truman administration who offered policy on post-World War II affairs and became one of the most prominent members of the group, which were being called the Wise Men. Next, he published his more famous X article in a 1947 issue of the Foreign Affairs Journal under a pseudonym simply named X. This was monumental. And soon, the entire US were debating the contents of the X article. Now, this is where things get kind of weird, if they're not weird already. Kennan and the other wise men were steering the United States on a path that it would eventually take for the rest of the Cold War. After all, remember that in World War II, the USA and the USSR were actually allies. They might have been at odds before, if not already in a Cold War, which is kind of what I believe. But World War II kind of thawed relations. So deciding how to handle the Soviets was an intense issue of debate in the late 1940s. And George F. Kennan proposed the most important of all of these early policies. It is called the Policy of Containment. The idea was to keep the Soviet Union and communism in general from spreading any further than it already had. Kennan proposed helping other nations on the frontiers of capitalism with monetary aid and sanctions on nations aligned with communism. The first step of this was to send aid to the Kuomintang in China, who were fighting a losing civil war against the communists led by Mao Zedong. Next, the Marshall Plan sent aid to Western Europe to help them rebuild after World War II so they didn't fall under the influence of the Eastern Bloc. That way, they would be better suited to maintaining their governments and not be prone to communist revolutions. But something changed in 1949. The Kuomintang lost the Civil War in China and fled to Taiwan, and the Soviets officially tested their first nuclear bomb. Tensions were about to explode. And then came Korea. The US and a few allies intervened into the Korean War in 1950. They were trying to halt the North Korean advance at the 48th parallel. But because of hawkish behavior that wanted full-out war, President Truman ordered the army to move northward beyond the 48th parallel, and eventually threatened the border with China. George F. Kennan fiercely disagreed with this step. He had proposed the policy of containment as a political and economic policy, not a military one. The long telegram and the X article did not speak of protracted warfare. He wanted the eventual economic downfall of the Soviet Union. His policy of containment was misused to justify more arms buildup and warfare, leading to things like the Vietnam War and nuclear arms buildup and mutually assured destruction. You know, that old beast. All of which was explicitly against his intent. Well, Truman didn't like that and basically booted him from the administration. He would have later work as a diplomat, but never as a policy maker of such renown. In the meantime, he went back to academia. During his time in Russia, he had researched a bunch into Russo-American relations. He gathered a bunch of material that is actually no longer available and put it to good use. So he wrote a few books on US-Russian relations. One in which I'm fond of is his book, The Decision to Intervene, which details the miserably stupid US intervention into the Russian Civil War. And longtime viewers of this channel will recognize it as one of my favorite subjects. His writing positively drips with the connotations of the stupid policy making at the top. Of course, in his writings he was attacking Woodrow Wilson, a worthy target if you ask me, but it heavily implies that the mistakes of the past should not be repeated. Plus, the way that he writes is so elegant that you really can't help but be affected by the meaning that it implies. Like what he said about the Russian intervention, it was a blunder comparable to the worst mistakes of the Crimean War. Its direct effect was to provide the Bolsheviks with a cheap victory, to give them new confidence, and to galvanize them into a strong, ruthless organization. Never, surely, in the history of American diplomacy has so much been paid for so little. Now that's not to say that he was innocent of hypocrisy on this. His policy of containment was partly copied from the Colby Doctrine of 1920. Even the general term for that policy used back then, a cordon sanitaire, is eerily similar to what Kennan helped to implement. But in either case, Kennan used his books to discourage actual warfare, not the Cold War as a whole. He became the primary orthodox historian on the Russian intervention, for which all historians subsequently must contend with. He would continue to write history and advocate particular policies for the rest of his life. Kennan championed the backlash to the idealistic foreign policy called the Wilson School, another malignant remnant of Woodrow Wilson. So he would call out the supposedly humanitarian interventions from the Clinton administration after the end of the Soviet Union. He continued the good fight against military intervention all the way until his death in 2005. So that is how a person who changed history can become a historian. For as Winston Churchill once said, "History shall be kind to me, for I intend to write it." George F. Kennan's policy of containment is practically the foundation of the Cold War. Yet, he was not the Cold Warrior people remember him as. So, are there any influential people you can think of that became historians like this? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe while you're at it. Oh, and by the way, yes, eventually I will do a Historians Who Made History about Woodrow Wilson, my most hated American president, who just happened to be a PhD and a historian. Ugh.